Are you getting sleepy? Been a long day at work? Are you ready to relax and drift off into nightmares? Well, these stories are perfect for you. Today I've got an assortment of creepy true stories written by subscribers and sent to me for your resting and listening pleasure. So close your eyes and rest your head. You can trust me, but I'm not sure you can trust whatever it is that's opening your closet door. If you have a story of your own, share it with us at darkstories.org. Now, let's begin. They told me they'd leave you alone. I remembered this story when I was driving home late the other night, and just thinking about it really creeped me out. This didn't happen to me, but I did hear it from my ex-girlfriend's grandma years ago about a friend of hers. We'll call her Grandma Z. Z worked as a therapeutic masseuse at a spa in a nice little town in northwest Arkansas. To give you a bit of an idea of what kind of person Z was, she lived in a little stone cottage with a shrine to a Hindu holy man as its centerpiece, and she carried pipe tobacco in her Volvo to sprinkle on roadkill. Now, she claimed it was a Native American ritual to help ferry the animal's spirit into the next life, or something along those lines. She was a nice enough woman, but obviously a bit eccentric. That being said, she seemed sincere and a little more than creeped out when she told us her story. Another masseuse that Z was close to at the spa, I'll call her M, arrived at work one day in the middle of the week in a haggard state. M was a young woman in her early 30s. She was friendly, and most of the time she had a bubbly personality. But on that day, she was aloof, downcast, and had bags under her eyes. Z noticed this the moment she walked in the door, but with work to do, she waited for a better time to ask M if everything was okay. When lunch came around, Z approached her friend and asked what was wrong. M brushed it off initially, saying that nothing was wrong, that she was simply tired. But Z persisted. M began to tear up then, and started to sob. Z embraced her and told her it was going to be all right, that she could share what was on her mind if she needed to. M's sobs subsided a little, and she began to speak, but then stopped. What she had to say, she told Z, was too crazy, and Z would never believe her. Z told M that she'd be surprised at what she may or may not find believable. So M composed herself a bit, and then began her story. M, her husband, and young son lived in a house about 20 miles outside of town. The house and the property were beautiful, essentially the couple's dream home. It included plenty of acreage nestled in a valley in the Ozark Mountains, and the house had a huge picture window in the living room, overlooking the valley and the forested mountains beyond. The night before, she'd awakened around 3:00 a.m. Nothing had startled her awake, no nightmares, no having to pee, but something had definitely awakened her, something that she wasn't aware of just yet. She lay in bed in the dark for a while, listening in the silence, trying to go back to sleep, but she couldn't. She then carefully rolled out of the bed, trying not to wake her husband, and then she made her way through the dark house to the kitchen for a snack. As she walked through the lightless living room, she looked out of the picture window and froze. There was something standing on the deck just outside, a small silhouette outlined in starlight. She studied the shape in wide-eyed fear as it stood motionless on the deck overlooking the valley. It seemed to be looking up. Her shock turned to concern and confusion when she realized what the figure was. It was her 8-year-old son. She quickly flung the sliding door to the deck open and wrapped the boy in her arms, asking, "Are you okay, honey? What's wrong? What are you doing out here?"
I'm looking at the lights,"
he said. Then he pointed out into the clear night sky. She followed the direction of his finger and saw several orbs of soft red, blue, and orange lights hovering over the valley. They were like bright stars at first, but then they moved slowly, deliberately into a formation. First a line, and then a cross, and then a diamond, and finally something that resembled the Big Dipper. There was nothing natural about their movement. They could not be shooting stars or aircraft. They weren't moving like that. It was like they were some sort of signal, almost as if they were communicating with something or someone. Im released her son from her arms and stood up hypnotized, staring at the lights too, as they changed formations and pulsated from dim to bright and back to dim again. Her son tugged on the hem of her nightshirt and said that he was cold. She broke her trance and took her son quickly by the shoulder, leading him inside impatiently. She slid the door closed behind her and locked it, doing her best not to look back out over the valley. She closed the blinds on the big window in the living room and ushered her son into her bedroom to sleep with her and her husband, with the lights on. Im stopped talking and looked up at Z, who looked back at her with eyes widened in amazement. She began to sob again. "Do you want to hear the really crazy part? The reason why this is so scary?" Z's mouth hung open as she thought about how to respond. Before she could reply, Im continued. Her father was a physicist who'd worked at a government lab in New Mexico. He was never able to tell her what exactly he did for reasons of national security, so to say. While working in the Southwest, he'd fallen in love with the region's harsh but beautiful mountains and desert landscapes. After divorcing Im's mother and retiring early with a handsome government pension, he bought a small ranch in Arizona. In the summertime, Im, then a young girl, would stay with her father at his ranch. It was a very remote property, part of its allure for him. It was in the foothills of some mountains in the desert, but it had access to a water source, and there was a small pond back behind the ranch house, overgrown with tall cattails. Early in the afternoon one summer day, Im's father left the ranch to run some errands in the nearest town. It was a brutally hot day, and Im did not want to ride in the stifling hot truck, so she begged her father to let her stay so she could swim in the pond. Reluctantly, he agreed. Once her father had left, Im put on her bathing suit and made her way down a small path of hot rocks and sand to the pond behind the house. The sky was almost impossibly blue in the clear, torturous Arizona summer heat. A slight breeze rustled the reeds and scrub brush, but it was otherwise silent, as if all the animal life had perished or gone underground to escape the relentless desert heat. As Im rounded the bank of cattails that obscured the pond from the house, she froze at an unexpected encounter. 3 tall beings were standing on the opposite side of the pond. They were all identical and stood facing her as she came into view, as if they'd been waiting for her. Im couldn't move. Whether that was from pure fear or something else, she couldn't tell. All she could do was stare in horror and disbelief at these things. They stood about 7 feet tall, each one completely indistinguishable from the other, as if they were clones or triplets or mirrored images of each other. They were vaguely humanoid, two unusually long and skinny arms that ended in spindly hands with long fingers, two long and thin legs, slender, elongated torsos, and skinnier necks. Their heads were long but proportional to the height and build of these things, whatever they were. They had ruddy tan and completely hairless skin, and wore what seemed to be blue skin-tight jumpsuits. But the strangest and most awful aspect of these things were their faces. They were completely featureless save for the eyes. No mouth, no ears, no nose. Just two somehow human-looking, but somehow not human-looking, eyes set into the blank tanned plane of their faces, staring dispassionately and emotionlessly at him. She blinked once, and soon found herself lying on the floor of her father's living room, right on her back. She was wrapped in the towel she'd taken with her to the pond, as if she'd been swaddled in it. The sun had gotten significantly lower in the sky. She could tell by the way it slanted in through the yellow blinds of the windows at a long angle. She sat up, confused and beginning to panic. She heard the ticking of the old grandfather clock and looked over at it. The time read 5 p.m. She'd somehow lost nearly 3 hours of time. How's that possible? How had she even gotten back to the house? Just as strangely, she was completely dry. Not a bead of sweat had gathered on her, even though her father's house lacked air conditioning and was sickly hot. Her father arrived not long afterward, pulling his truck down the long driveway of the ranch. When he entered the house with his sack of groceries, he found Em in a state of distress. She told him in a panicked frenzy what she'd seen, what had happened to her at the pond, how she'd somehow lost 3 hours of her life. The old physicist stared coldly into the distance, waiting for his daughter to finish the story, then told her, "But they told me they'd leave you alone." Em was shaking and began to cry again. Z held her and she buried her face in Z's arms. "That's why I'm afraid," she said. "I'm afraid that they came back for my son." The Gray Creature. I lay in bed one morning, as I always do, scrolling through social media until I received a call from Bill, my grandfather. Bill asked me and my little brother, Ryan, if we wanted to go on a trip down to a small cabin he and his brother built. Me and Ryan immediately agreed, as it would be a great time for all of us. So when he came over to our house to pick us up, we started joking and cutting up, teasing one another about Sasquatch and other creatures like we always did. The ride was around 2.5 hours long, but we broke the silence by starting up random conversations. As we passed time through these conversations, we were all ready to just have a great time together at the cabin. Once we made it there, I was so excited to begin our stay. We went about getting unpacked and ready for the night, arranging our beds and rooms. By nightfall, we were all exhausted. So we cozied up in the living room, watching some paranormal show, but I was more interested in watching the back of my eyelids, to be honest. I woke up multiple times through the night, not knowing why. I only assumed it was because of me not being at home. At one point, I woke up at around 2:30 a.m. I had to use the restroom. I told Bill where I was going just in case something happened, as I'd have to use the restroom outside. The place did not have a toilet. I made my way outdoors, turning the cabin light on, which was bright enough. I quickly found a spot to use the restroom. I finished up and wanted to casually stand on the porch for a while, to take in the beauty and the fresh air. Bill came out at that point to enjoy it as well. He and I stood there until I caught something with my eye that was crouching under a tree branch, with some other small trees surrounding the area. I pointed it out to Bill. He wasn't sure what I was pointing at first, until he spotted it too. This creature was gray, skin stretched taut around every bone, as if it were a morph suit instead of flesh. It was completely nude, and I could not make out any parts of it that would tell me if it was a boy or a girl. Its arms were frail, and its legs were too, though I felt deep inside that this thing could easily kill me if it got its hands on me. As we both watched it, I told Bill to grab a gun as quickly as he could, just in case. And as I said this, the creature took off, bolting across to some small wooded area barely having any trees. This was much closer to the cabin than the previous position. I stood there myself, ready to bolt inside if need be. But Bill soon came back with his gun loaded, and we were ready to stand our ground against this thing. A few seconds later, we see a rabbit come out from those same trees that thing went behind. My gut feeling sensed something wasn't right about it, but it quickly ran off to the original position that creature had been, never to be seen again. We waited for a while, waiting for the creature to emerge again, but it never did. We checked the spot it had been hiding, but it was gone, which was impossible as we'd have to see it if it ever came out. We went inside and tried to get some sleep. Bill was more successful at this than I was. The following morning, we told Ryan and my grandfather's brother. Ryan believed us, and my grandfather's brother was skeptical. Bill drove us back that morning, calling off the cabin retreat a bit early, and I was relieved to be at home again and away from those woods. Sometime later after this incident, we would learn that my grandfather's brother became quite wary of the cabin too, and often refused to go back. Apparently, he had an experience there too, one he doesn't want to talk about, but it obviously scared him. As for me, I think that thing we saw, it was the rabbit too. And though that doesn't make sense, I think this experience was paranormal or supernatural, and it's not going to make sense no matter how I look at it. Creepy sighting in the woods. Well, I'm a stoner, plain and simple. One time I bought around 2 to 3 grams and wanted to smoke some. My parents are very strict about weed, so I couldn't just roll up and smoke in my house. So like an idiot, I thought it would be a good idea to go for a long blunt walk in the woods. I've done it 10,000 times and knew exactly what trail I was going to take, since I basically lived in these woods as a kid. It must have been around 4:30 p.m., and it was winter, so it gets pretty dark. I didn't care though. I had a phone and a lighter, so I was good. I also carried my pocket knife everywhere I went, just to be safe. As I was walking through the woods, I'd barely just lit up, when all of a sudden I hear a noise. I shine my light over and see what seems to be a deer. So I roll my eyes and continue my walk. 10 minutes later, I'm starting to feel pretty high and decide it's too cold to walk anymore. I didn't want to ruin my high with the cold. I start my walk back to my house when I see the same deer. But this time I got a good look at it. It was tall, maybe 6'5", maybe taller. I was 17 and 5'8", so I'm not too small, but I'm definitely not big. After I saw how tall it was, I looked at its body, and it looks like it had been shot. It was bleeding profusely, but it was past hunting hours, and I was less than 200 feet from local apartments, and I was pretty sure I would have heard a gunshot, but I hadn't. After seeing blood, I see its face, and oh my god, its freaking face was enough to sober me up right away. Its jaw was halfway hanging off of its body. Its skull was showing, but the worst part were the eyes. The cold, dead black eyes. After standing there, just looking at this thing after a solid minute or two, it begins walking towards me, one step at a time. Its movements were all jagged and jerky, like a broken toy that's supposed to be able to walk. I come to my senses after seeing it walk and realize it's on the trail leading back to my house. As I said though, I basically grew up in these woods. I knew every path and where every path took you, so I turn around and make a break for it. As I do, I hear this ear-piercing scream unlike anything I'd ever heard before. I kept running and running until I made it back home, but the entire time it sounded like it was right behind me. I make it back to my house and run straight to my room, freaking out. I'd never seen anything like it. I got to school the next morning and had asked my friends if they heard the scream that night, because we all lived pretty close together in the woods. None of them had heard it, and they assumed I just smoked something that was laced, but I know I didn't. I can't just imagine something like this. I've gone back there a few times, but I've never seen it again. I just want some insight about what it could be. I'm hoping that Wendigo or Skinwalker are not native here. The Rat Man. For years I've wondered and tried to figure out what this thing could have been, but I've come up with nothing. This is my sister's story, but I'm hoping someone will know what to call it. It all began when we were young. My eldest sister was 6 years old and we had just moved into a new house. It happened one night when we had gone to bed. My sister was in her room. She looked down when she heard a crawling sound and saw that a rat with human hands was crawling into her room. She gasped, and it looked up at her with red eyes, and she swears it smiled, then proceeded to crawl under her bed. For the next 3 years, Haley dreamed of it, saw it, and woke up to it right in her face almost every night. She developed insomnia at a very early age and would be up for days at a time, often passing out randomly throughout the day. My mother brought her to doctors and therapists, and all Haley would say is that the Rat Man would not allow her to sleep. It would grab at her feet, chase her through the hallways if she tried to get to her parents' room, scratch at her bedposts. She was a nervous wreck pretty much all the time. The worst was the night she dreamed of the Rat Man chasing her up the stairs. She woke up in her bed, only to see rats all over the floor in her room. She screamed so loud it woke up everyone in the house. When my parents ran in and turned on the lights, the rats were no longer there. My mom didn't know what to do about this, thinking she was having some very extreme night terrors. Eventually, when Haley was turning 9, my mom gave her an old lion doll. Apparently, it had been our great-grandmother's. She told her that when she was scared, she could whisper her fears to it, and the doll would protect her. Pretty standard child-stuffed toy stuff. But that was when she stopped seeing the rat. No one really questioned it, just thinking it to be normal childhood stuff. Eventually, children grow out of their fears. Haley eventually forgot about the Rat Man until the day she woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of a growl. She looked to her door to see the rat glaring from the doorway. But this time, she was not afraid. She drowsily looked over to see the tail of what appeared to be a lion patrolling around her bed. She did not question this and instead went back to sleep. Now, Haley still sees the rat from time to time. I even saw it once when I woke up in the middle of the night. I even remember seeing the tail of that lion a couple of times. Anytime Haley sees the rat, or even anything else that frightens her, she knows a visit from the lion is coming soon. She doesn't seem to care about what either the rat or the lion are, but I can't handle not knowing what's in my house. I'm glad she's protected. I just wish I knew what that rat man thing was. Possible Skinwalker. My name is Elijah, but everyone calls me Gator. Last year, my friends and I went camping out in the woods near my home. We live in a small town in North Carolina. The first day of camping went by as usual. We got to the pond and unpacked the car, got some camo set up and lit a fire. The second day is when weird things started happening. We got up to smoke, then went fishing. There's a river half a mile through the woods, so we thought we'd catch something there to eat for the day. As we walked, Zach pointed out some very strange-looking footprints. I hunt quite a bit, and I can tell you readily that the deer down here don't get that big. But these tracks appeared to be bipedal, and oddly enough, they were heading towards our camp. They were fresh enough to have been created after we set up camp, so why they were heading towards our camp, I don't know. Surely they would have heard or smelled us last night. I bent down to look at them more closely. They were almost bigger than my hand. We continued down the trail, talking about the tracks we saw. Finally, we made it to the river. We sat down at our usual spot and began to fish. About an hour later, we had 5 decent-sized red drums, so we packed up and started heading back. But then we heard a loud scream that went on for at least 15 seconds. It was distant, so I wasn't too worried about it. I tried to calm us all down by saying it was just a panther. There have been a few sighted in that area. When we got back to the camp, we were all still on edge. There were the same tracks we found earlier all around our tents now. 3 giant claw marks on the side of my tent in particular. Well, it definitely wasn't a deer now. We stirred the fire back up and made some breakfast. The rest of the day was pretty chill. We assumed that the weird activity may have been caused by someone who was trying to prank us or mess with us. We took a few walks and went swimming. And later on, we discussed around the fire what we were going to do over the summer. Afterwards, we went to bed. But I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of that screaming again. What sent chills throughout my body was the fact that the sound was closer than before. Too close. I grabbed my Mossberg 500 and climbed out of my tent. My friends Zach and Pipper were already out of theirs. I asked if they'd heard it, and Zach gave me a look like, duh, of course we did. I threw a few logs on the fire. We all sat around, listening to the sounds of the woods. Then, suddenly, it got real quiet. The birds and the bugs were suddenly muted. The only sounds that I could hear then were the fire and footsteps. We looked around the camp trying to see what the footsteps were coming from, until something revealed itself close to the fire. It was hard to see still, but it was definitely there. Something big, something extremely tall, taller than all of us. We thought it was some person, but they were a little too big, and while it had the body of a man, the fire showed us that its skin was almost solid white. Instead of where the guy's head should have been, instead there was a cervidae-shaped skull. I told Zach to grab the keys from his tent quickly. I looked over at Pipper. He was still staring at the thing. Zach grabbed the keys, and we all jumped into his car. I kept glancing back at the thing, and it didn't move. It only seemed to want to watch us. When we all got in with Zach, he hit the pedal. We went flying down the trails. We must have been driving for 5 or 6 minutes, obviously thinking we'd gotten out of Dodge and away from harm. When, suddenly, something massive slammed into the side of the SUV, causing it to raise up a bit and fall back down. We all screamed. Zach floored it, going way faster than he ever should through those trails. Ever since then, we haven't been out camping, and I'm not sure we ever will again. But I'm curious as to who may have had a similar encounter in that area. While I do hope we're not alone in this, maybe it's for the best, because no one would want to encounter this thing. Aliens coming for your children, shape-shifting creatures watching your cabin. These are allegedly real-life nightmares that may or may not keep you up all night. I hope you enjoyed them, and I hope you get plenty of rest, because you're gonna need it. Good night. If you enjoyed this episode of Darkness Prevails, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you have a story of your own, share it with us at darkstories.org. Remember that you can support the show via the link below. There's a link to my Patreon and a link to my merch store. Now, as usual, here are my 5 favorite early comments from the previous episode about 5 scary stories for a night drive. Hell Fulfsky says, "What is this day? My crush asked me out and Darkness uploaded. I'm scared." Well, sounds like you had a great day, and I wish you the best. Man, I hope my wife asks me out sometime soon. I've got a crush on her. And Maggot Bam Bam 100 says, "Monster is greater than any other energy drink." That's a really weird way to spell full throttle, my friend. Kevin Lee says, "My night is sorted out now." Well, I'm glad I could help you with that. Now if only you and I could both experience our own horrors in the night. What a night drive that would be. Vegan Jinx says, "Currently on a night drive in North Carolina." Perfect. Well, hope you made it safe. Don't forget that werewolves apparently love to run along your car. And Carter Murdoch says, "Shrek is my favorite anime." Same here, fam. Same here. Well, that brings us to the end of this Darkness Prevails episode. But don't you worry, because more scary stories are on the way. Until next time, here are the credits to my amazing patrons who continue to donate. They raise my spirits. Remember, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.